There's a kind of quiet that only Wyoming knows. Not silence, never silence. The wind still moves through the tall grass. The horses still shift in the corral. Somewhere far off, a meadowlark calls once and doesn't call again. But beneath all of it, beneath the creak of the fence post and the slow roll of clouds over the mountains, there's a stillness. A peace so deep it settles in the chest like warm bread after a long day's ride. My name is Wyatt Calloway. I'm 26 years old, and I've worked this land since I was old enough to carry a hammer. I fix fences because fences need fixing. I rise before the sun because the cattle don't wait. I eat alone at a table built for four because the house has been quiet since my mother passed, quiet in ways that wind and open sky can't fill. I wasn't a lonely man. I told myself that often enough that I almost believed it. And then, on a Tuesday in the middle of June, in the year 1885, a woman drove a wagon down my road, got one wheel stuck clean in the mud, stepped down without a word of complaint, and started pulling crates out of the back like she'd been doing it all her life. Her name was Margaret Ellison. Everybody who knew her called her Maggie, though it took most people a season or two to earn that. She was 41 years old, composed as still water, and entirely unimpressed by me. I didn't stand a chance. She didn't ask for help. That was the first thing I noticed. Not her dark hair pulled back tight against the sun. Not the calm set of her jaw. Not the way her gray traveling dress was already dusted at the hem from the muddy road. What I noticed first was that she didn't call out, didn't wave her arms, didn't do any of the things people do when they want someone to come running. She just worked. I'd been replacing a post on the south fence line when the wagon appeared at the bend in the road. I watched it slow down, watched the right front wheel sink into the rut left by the week's rain, watched the whole rig tilt sideways with a groan of wood and iron. I set down my hammer and waited. She climbed down from the seat with the careful movements of someone who'd learned a long time ago not to trust unstable ground. Walked around to the back, pulled the canvas aside, and started unloading crates one at a time, setting them in a neat stack on the dry grass beside the road. I walked over. I said. She looked up without startling. Eyes the color of strong coffee, dark, steady, giving nothing away. She took in my age in a single glance, and something in her expression closed, just slightly, like a door eased shut rather than slammed. Morning, she said, though it was well past noon. Afternoon, I said. She looked at the sun, calculated quietly, and gave a small nod. Afternoon, then. I crouched beside the wheel and pressed my hand into the mud around the axle. Deep, but not hopeless. I got my shoulder behind the wagon frame. She took the reins without being told, climbed back up, clicked her tongue at the horse, and waited. It took 2 tries. On the second, the wheel broke free with a sucking pull, and the wagon rolled forward onto solid ground. She looked back at me, mud on my sleeve, my breath steady. Thank you, she said. Where are you headed? Birch Hollow. I'm the new schoolteacher. I nodded once. Road forks a half-mile ahead. Take the right. She studied me a moment longer than was strictly polite. Then she climbed down and began loading the crates back into the wagon. I picked up the other end without asking. Before this story gets much further, if it's settling in nice and easy for you, go ahead and hit that subscribe button and leave us a like. It costs you nothing and it means everything to this channel. Now let's see if that schoolteacher makes it to Birch Hollow without looking back. She did look back. Once. Just before the road bent around a stand of cottonwoods and the wagon would have disappeared from view entirely. She turned her head, not her whole body, just her head, and I was still standing there at the fence line, hammer back in hand, already working. I didn't wave. Neither did she. She told herself later it meant nothing. A young man being decent on a country road, that was all. Wyoming was full of decent young men, boys really, most of them. She'd owned boots older than 26. She almost smiled at that thought. Almost. Birch Hollow was smaller than the letter from the school board had suggested. One main street, a general store, a church that doubled as a meeting hall, and a schoolhouse at the edge of town that needed paint badly and a new door latch worse. Her landlady, a widow named Mrs. Pruitt, took one look at her traveling trunk and said, "You've moved before." "Several times," Maggie said. "You running towards something, or away?" "Neither. I go where the work is." Mrs. Pruitt left a pitcher of water and a plate of biscuits on the dresser and closed the door softly behind her. Maggie sat on the edge of the bed. Outside the window, the Wyoming evening was settling in, purple and gold over the ridgeline, the first stars already faint above the hills. A dog barked somewhere down the street. A screen door banged. Someone was frying something with onions. Ordinary sounds. The sounds of a town going about its life without her. She had arrived in towns like this 9 times before, always the stranger, always the schoolteacher, always the woman who was competent and reliable and who no one thought to invite to supper because surely she had her own arrangements. She ate the biscuits alone. They were good biscuits. She didn't let herself think about the man at the fence. She only half succeeded. I came to town 4 days later with a sack of nails I genuinely needed and a route through the main street that was genuinely out of my way. I was coming out of the hardware store when I nearly walked into her outside the general store, standing on the boardwalk with a list in one hand and a look of mild annoyance directed at a sack of flour that was not the weight she'd been promised. "That's 30 pounds, not 40, she was telling the store clerk, a boy of maybe 16 who clearly wasn't used to being corrected in that particular tone of voice. "Yes," the boy said, and went back inside. She turned and found me 2 feet away. Surprise first, then composure settling over her features like a curtain drawn evenly across a window. "I know your name," she said. "Calloway. Wyatt Calloway." "Miss Ellison," I said. "Though you likely already knew that." Word travels. A faint smile, brief as a cloud shadow crossing open grass. Hardware store? Nails? The fence? I blinked. I hadn't expected her to remember. "Same one," I said. "Is it giving you trouble?" "Posts rot," I said. "It's just the nature of things." "I suppose it is," she said. The clerk returned with a corrected ticket. Maggie checked it, signed it, turned back to me as if she'd been aware of me the entire time, which I suspect she had. "Good afternoon, Mr. Calloway." "Miss Ellison." She walked away at an even, unhurried pace. I stood on the boardwalk a moment longer than necessary. I decided I needed more nails the next week, too. October came in cold and gold and found me standing in my barn at dusk, talking to my horse. This wasn't new. I'd been talking to horses since before I could properly talk to people. But the subject had shifted. She looked out the window again, I told the mare, who was eating and thus willing to listen. "Friday, 8:30, same as last week." The mare did not comment. "I know how it looks," I said. "I know what the town thinks. Pruitt woman's already got opinions." I leaned against the stall post, arms crossed, looking at nothing in particular. "Doesn't change what I see when I'm around her," I said. "Doesn't change that she's the most honest person I've met in this county. Doesn't change that she laughed last Tuesday, and I've been thinking about it since." The mare shifted. "She's 41 years old," I said quietly, like I was testing the words for weight. "And I'm 26. And I know that. I'm not a fool." I was quiet a moment. But I've run this ranch since I was 19. I've made decisions most men twice my age haven't had to make. I buried my mother without falling apart, and I kept the cattle through 2 bad winters, and I've never asked a single person for something I couldn't justify. I pushed off the post and picked up the feed bucket. So I'm asking myself one question. Not what the town thinks. Not what she thinks right now, because right now she's still deciding. I set the bucket down. The question is whether she's worth waiting for. I looked at the mare. She is, I said. That's the whole of it. I went back to the house, ate alone at the table built for 4, and for the first time since my mother passed, I looked at the empty chairs without the familiar heaviness. Looked at them and thought, quietly, not always. I allowed myself that much. One thought. Not always. Then I washed my plate, banked the fire, and went to bed, because the cattle still needed tending at dawn, and patience had never once meant standing still. She told herself she wasn't watching the road. She knew the sound of my wagon now, the particular creak of it, the rhythm of the horse. And when it passed the schoolhouse on Friday afternoon at 8:30, she set down her chalk and looked out the window. I wasn't stopping. Good, she thought. That was good. She wasn't a woman who entertained foolishness. She'd done that once back in Missouri at 29, with a man who had broad shoulders and a quick smile and absolutely no intention of staying. She'd believed things she shouldn't have believed and learned the lesson plainly. Self-sufficiency wasn't a consolation prize. It was armor. And armor kept you standing. She turned back to the blackboard. She was 41 years old. She had a teaching certificate and 9 towns behind her and a life that was perfectly manageable. The children were bright. The town was quiet. Mrs. Pruitt's biscuits were excellent. That was enough. On Sunday, the church held a social. Maggie brought a spice cake because it was expected, and meeting expectations in a new town was simply efficient. I was there near the fence at the edge of the churchyard, slightly apart from the ranchers talking cattle prices, tin plate in hand, looking like a man entirely comfortable in his own company. I saw her across the yard. One nod. The same nod I'd given on the road. Your existence is a fact I have accepted and intend to continue accepting. She nodded back. Mrs. Pruitt appeared at her elbow with the energy of a woman who found silence deeply suspicious. You know Wyatt Calloway? We've met. Good boy. Steady. Runs that ranch alone since his mother passed. A meaningful pause. Young, of course. Very, Maggie said. Mrs. Pruitt smiled and said nothing else, which was somehow worse. Maggie ate her cake and did not look across the yard again. She looked twice. I asked her to walk. No moonlight, no borrowed courage. A Sunday afternoon with a blue sky and a prairie wind and half the town 20 yards away eating pie, and I simply came to stand beside her near the cottonwood and said quietly, "Would you want to walk a little? There's a good view of the valley from the East Ridge." She looked at me. I looked back. No expectation, no performance. Just a question. People will notice, she said. Probably. She considered the cake on her plate, the 15-minute walk, Mrs. Pruitt's face. All right, she said. We walked. I didn't talk much, which she appreciated. I pointed out a hawk riding the thermals above the ridge, tilted my head upward and said, red-tailed. Nesting up there since I was a boy. She watched it circle. You grew up here, she said. Born in that ranch house. Never really left. Does that bother you? I thought about it honestly. No. Some people need to go looking. I always figured what I needed was right here, and I just had to tend it right. Below us, the valley stretched in every shade of gold and green, the river catching light in the middle distance, the town small and settled at the far edge. "It's beautiful," she said. "Yes," I said. She glanced sideways and found me looking at her, not the valley. "Mr. Calloway." "Wyatt." "Mr. Calloway," she said firmly, but without cruelty. "I am 41 years old." "I know that." "You are 26. "I know that, too." She exhaled slowly. "Then you understand why this walk is simply a walk." "Yes," I said. A beat of silence. "But it's a good walk," I added. She looked straight ahead at the valley and the mountains and the hawk still turning slow circles in the high autumn air. She did not smile. She almost did not smile. I brought her apples. A basket of them, left on the schoolhouse steps on a Monday morning before she arrived. No note, just the basket, the apples, and the early morning light on weathered wood. She stood there looking at them for a long moment. Then she carried them inside and set them on her desk. And when one of her students asked where she'd gotten all those apples, she said, "A neighbor was generous," and let it stay at that. She kept 2 apples and returned the basket to my ranch on Saturday. It was proper. You return a borrowed basket. That was manners, not intention. The ranch was well kept, fences recently mended, barn solid, house with real glass in the windows. I came out wiping my hands on a cloth, and when I saw her, I went still for just a moment, the way I sometimes did, like a man making sure of what he was seeing before he committed to a response. "I brought a cake," she said. "You can't return a kindness with an empty plate." "Come in," I said. "I'll put coffee on." She hesitated on the wagon seat. This was the moment. She knew it with the same clarity she'd known things she'd learned the hard way. Walk inside, and something between us would stop being deniable. Not because anything improper would happen, but because sitting across a table from someone and sharing something you made with your hands, that was a choice. That meant something. She climbed down. "I can only stay an hour," she said. "That's plenty," I said. I held the door. She walked through it. The kitchen smelled like wood smoke and coffee and something that felt, against all her better judgment, like a room that had been waiting for someone to use it properly. We stayed 2 hours. She didn't notice until the light changed, the kitchen going from gold to amber. She looked up from the empty cake plate, the cold coffee, the conversation that had moved from students to weather to my mother's land to her years of moving and never quite arriving anywhere. 2 hours. She looked at her hands. "I should go." "I know," I said. Neither of us moved for a moment. "Wyatt," she said. My name, said plainly. I registered it, a small stillness, quickly recovered. "What is it you think this is?" she asked. "2 people who are good in each other's company. That's all?" "That's not nothing," I said quietly. "In my experience, that's the thing most people never find." She looked at me across the table, this broad-shouldered young man who had never once said an untrue thing to her. "Sunday," she said finally. "Come to supper. I'll cook this time." I looked at her steadily. "Yes," I said. She drove home in the early dark. The Wyoming quiet wrapped around her like something she hadn't known she'd been missing. Winter came to Birch Hollow in November. It arrived the way Wyoming winter always did, not gradually, but all at once, as if the mountains had simply decided and the valley had no vote in the matter. The first snow fell on a Tuesday, quiet and total, covering the rutted road and the bare cottonwoods and the schoolhouse yard in white so clean it looked like the world had been given a second chance. Maggie stood at the schoolhouse window and watched it come down. She was aware, with the precision she brought to most things, that she was happy. Not content, not managing. Happy, in the uncomplicated way she hadn't been since before Missouri, before the man who didn't stay, before she'd learned to keep the door of herself closed for safekeeping. The supper had happened, then another, then a Sunday afternoon ride up to the ridge with the valley white below us and our breath visible in the cold air, and me pointing out the red-tailed hawk's empty nest in the high branches. "Gone south," I said. "She'll be back in March." As if I were simply reporting facts about someone we both knew. She had started to look forward to Fridays. She had stopped pretending she didn't. In December, Mrs. Pruitt said, without preamble, over breakfast, "He's going to ask you something." Maggie set down her coffee. "Mrs. Pruitt, I'm not advising. I'm informing." The older woman refilled her own cup. "He came to speak with the Reverend last week." Reverend told his wife. His wife told her sister. Maggie sat down. "This is a small town," she said. "He's 26, Maggie said, not as argument, almost as wonder. "Yes," Mrs. Pruitt said. "And he's the steadiest man in this county at any age. And you have spent the last 6 months being careful and sensible and correct." She folded her hands. "How is that working for you?" Maggie looked out the window at the snow. She thought of the empty chairs at my kitchen table. She thought of the hawk's nest in the high branches. "She'll be back in March." "Well enough," she said. But she was smiling when she said it. I asked her on a Thursday evening in January, with the temperature below freezing and the wind coming off the mountains hard enough to make the schoolhouse windows rattle. I had come to fix the window latch. It had been loose since October, and I had apparently decided that January was the appropriate moment. She had made tea, because it was cold and I was there, and there was no longer any point pretending the tea was anything but an excuse to extend the hour. I fixed the latch. I drank the tea. I stood with my shoulders nearly filling the door frame and my hat in my hands and looked at her with eyes that hadn't once, in 7 months, looked at her with anything she needed to defend herself against. "I have something to ask you," I said. "I know," she said. A pause. "Mrs. Pruitt," I said. "The whole town, apparently," she said. I nodded slowly. Something in my face that was almost amusement, almost nerves, and entirely me. "Then I'll just ask it plainly. Please." Maggie. Her name, no title, for only the second time. "I know who you are. I know what it cost you to walk through that kitchen door. I know you have more years and more reasons for caution than I do." I held her gaze without wavering. "I'm not asking you to stop being careful," I said. "I'm asking you to be careful with me instead of from me." She was quiet for a long moment. The wind pushed at the windows. The lamp threw its small circle of warmth. She thought of Missouri, of 9 towns, of biscuits eaten alone in a dozen different rooms. She thought of the valley from the East Ridge, gold and green and endlessly wide. She looked at me. "You're going to have a very stubborn wife," she said. I exhaled, slow and steady, like a man who'd been holding something carefully for a very long time. "Yes," I said. "I'm counting on it." I was still holding my hat. She reached out and took it from my hands. We married in April, on a Saturday, when the valley had finally remembered how to be green. The church was full. Birch Hollow was a small town, and small towns show up for things that matter. And this one, it had decided, mattered. Mrs. Pruitt sat in the front pew and did not cry, though her handkerchief saw considerable use. I stood at the altar in a dark coat that fit across my shoulders the way a coat should fit on a man who worked his body honestly. My hair was combed, my collar straight, my eyes fixed on the door at the back of the church with the steady patience that was simply the way I existed in the world. The door opened. Maggie walked in alone. She had no one to give her away. She pointed this out to the Reverend, who had suggested various alternatives, all of which she had declined with polite efficiency. She walked down the aisle in a dress the color of new cream. Her dark hair pinned up and then, because she was who she was, slightly less pinned than she'd intended, one wave loose at her jaw. She carried a small bunch of early wildflowers that Mrs. Pruitt had pressed into her hands that morning without a word. She was 41 years old, and she was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. I told her that later, that night at the kitchen table, over supper that neither of us ate much of because there was too much else to pay attention to. She told me that was a foolish thing to say. I said I'd say it anyway. She looked at me across the table, this man of 26 who had fixed her wheel and brought her apples and waited without complaint and asked plainly and held the door open and meant every single word he'd ever said. Outside, the Wyoming spring was arriving in its own unhurried way. Inside, for the first time in a long time, the table wasn't set for one. There's no thunder in this story. No gunfight. No villain. No burning barn. Just a woman who had learned to need nothing, and a young man patient enough to wait for her to remember that needing someone isn't the same as being weak. Maggie Ellison drove into Birch Hollow with a trunk, a teaching certificate, and a heart she'd kept locked for over a decade. I fixed fences and waited. Not because I had nothing better to do, but because I had decided, in a barn at dusk, with only a horse listening, that she was worth it. And in April, in a church full of people who showed up because it mattered, stubborn as a prairie root, both of us, we found out I was right. Sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is walk through a door they've been standing outside for a very long time. Wyoming will teach you that, if you let it. If this story gave you a little peace today, if you made it all the way to that church and felt something when the door opened, then you're exactly who Frontier Hearts was made for. Subscribe to the channel, leave us a like, and tell us in the comments, were you rooting for them from the beginning, or did Maggie take a while to win you over? There are more stories where this one came from. More wide skies, more quiet courage, more love that arrives when you've stopped looking for it. This is Frontier Hearts. Until next time.